Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Tapas joins me and we're going to discuss different kind of specifics around JavaScript functions, as well as ending with maybe some career advice as well for people kind of early on in their careers and different things like that. But before we get to that, Tapas, could you maybe give me a bit of your story so far when it comes to your tech career?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for inviting me. It's amazing. I was just looking into your older podcast, like how it goes and things like that. There are a lot of, I found a few friends actually that I know them from Twitter and LinkedIn. So good to see them over there. It's awesome. So coming to myself, I'm Tapas from India, and I am into programming is almost for last 18-19 years. It's been a lot, I guess. And majority of my time I have spent in UI and UX, like user experience and user interface development. And as it points to JavaScript became one of the go-to language and go-to thing for me to kind of learn and enjoy. So I've been doing it for years for now. Over the years, it's I picked up blogging, and teaching is another side hustle apart from the programming. And started blogging actively since 2018-19, and then very recently on YouTube, started on YouTube channel and trying to teach people what I know. So that's my passion as well. Also connect to a lot of freshers and folks who need some guidance and kind of talk to them, sharing experience kind of stuff. So that's what basically I do.
Awesome. And definitely a lot of experience, which is why I kind of want to end with some career advice as well. As you've kind of been in this development world for, like you said, almost 20 years at this point. So yeah. I think that, kind of giving some advice to people kind of early on in their careers to maybe prevent some mistakes will be good to kind of end with.
Sure.
But you've also kind of created a course that's a deep dive into JavaScript functions, and we're probably not going to get too terribly technical here, as I think that, there's only so much you could do over more of an audio focused kind of platform here. But I think a good first place to start here is just what are JavaScript functions? And then from there, we'll get into some other specifics.
Sure. I think in general, functions in any programming language, not only JavaScript, the availability of functions are everywhere. So in general, what function does is basically helping us not to do the task which are very repeated. We in general in our personal life don't want to do same thing again and again. We want to kind of do a lot of automations. We want to do something which is we define once and try to reuse it again and again. Function exactly help us in doing that. So in JavaScript also, if you are doing some work or doing some task repeatedly, you better create a function, and instead of again writing that bunch of code, you just use that function, call that function, and your work will be done.
Gotcha. So it prevents you from having to just rewrite the same code over and over again. And this can also have some benefits when it comes to if you ever need to refactor your code in the future and you need to change just a little piece of your logic. If you just wrote that once in a function, then you just have to change it at one place rather than needing to go around your entire program everywhere you're kind of repeating yourself and stuff like that. So
yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good overview on what functions are, but there's also some maybe confusing terminology when someone's starting out kind of surrounding functions. So maybe if we could just go through a few of these terms and kind of cover what they are. So we have the kind of term function declarations. What is someone kind of talking about when they say declarations?
Yes, sure. So one thing I feel in programming, some of these programming terminologies and jargons are much more difficult than the programming itself. So if we demystify those jargon, it becomes more simpler. You're very right. So in function also, there is function declaration, and then there's function definition. Often people get confused about what are those same thing or different things. It's kind of similar. It's as we spoke about function, you have a bunch of code, but those are there are chances of being repeated. Instead of that, repeating it, you want to create it as a function. So it means you have to define it somewhere. And as all of us human being has our own name, you can also give function a name so that you can take that name to call it anywhere you want. So wherever you give that name along with the function keyword, and then the function body where you write the code that you wanted to reuse everywhere, that's what is called declaration or definition. Then you take the function name along with the parenthesis, and you can actually invoke or call everywhere. So this is another one, invoking and calling. other places as well.
Awesome. And kind of moving from that, we also have the idea of, and my voice is kind of failing me a little bit this morning, so hopefully the listeners don't mind a little too much, but we also have the idea of arguments and parameters. And I think that these two can kind of be mixed up quite a bit when someone's starting out as well. So what are arguments and parameters?
Yeah, I think this is like way confusing piece, arguments and parameters terminology wise. And I think one of the favorite interview questions also. So whenever you define a function or declare a function, if you need certain things to be passed to the function from the outside world, you need to have certain placeholders along with the function definitions. So those placeholders you define inside that curly braces after the function name. That's basically your parameter. Those are all placeholders when you're defining the function. But when you call the function, you pass the actual value to those placeholders, right? Those actual value that you pass while calling the function, that is what is argument. So often people like interchangeably use parameter and argument. It might kind of confuse, but parameter is what, while defining whatever you pass in the parenthesis, argument is the actual value, what you, while calling the function you pass.
Perfect. And that is absolutely a very common interview question. I definitely think I've been asked that on interviews before, and like in the context of an interview, it can also make you kind of second guess, like, wait, what was a parameter? What was an argument? But yeah, I think that was a great kind of definition there. So kind of with that, JavaScript also has a couple of other concepts very related to functions. And one of those is a callback. And I think this is also kind of a term that it's not like crazy complex, but I think when people first hear it, it doesn't totally make sense. So what is someone talking about when they say, you could just use a callback function, or that's just a callback function? What kind of does that mean in JavaScript?
Yeah, I think the answer is in the name itself. It's like callback. So it's like, call me back whenever you want. It's like, that's what the function is supposed to do. So what happened is like, you have a function, and function is supposed to do certain things. And those certain things are usually the single line programming statement. Like you might have something console.log, or if you're doing arithmetic operation like a plus b, let c equals to a plus b, or things like that. But along with doing all this programming instruction expression, you can also call another function inside a function. And that function that you want to call inside a function, you can pass that function as an argument. So it means that when you call one function, you can pass another function as an argument to the other function. And then the function that you're passing as an argument, you can call it based on any condition inside that function. So if you can call it if sum is greater than 30, if you call him if the person is a male, based on any condition, you can actually call that function that you are passing. So as you're calling back that function based on certain point in time, based on certain conditions, that's exactly why it's called callback. And I think in JavaScript, we use it like day in, day out, right? The callback thing is like, that's one of the instruments that we get for asynchronous programming. In the very early days of asynchronous programming, we used to use callback a lot. Then people figured out using too much callback, pushed them towards callback hell. Then they went for promises, then promise hell, then async await. So yeah, the legacy was callback. We started with the functions.
Awesome. And maybe a related concept to this is also higher order functions. And I think this is another term that can be kind of tricky for someone starting out. And especially like in JavaScript, there is like quite a bit to learn, and there's a lot of different things surrounding just functions. So I think this is another tricky piece. So what maybe is a higher order function? What does someone kind of mean when they say, oh, you can create a higher order function for that?
Yeah, exactly. So this is another like jargon that we need to be a little bit aware of. And this is something that I myself used to confuse a lot with callback functions, right? So in callback function, usually you take a function as a parameter and pass it as an argument, and you call it at a later point of time. But higher order function goes to the next level. It's a function where you can pass another function as an argument, or you can return a function from another function. So if there is a function A, you can pass function B as an argument, or you can return function C from the function A. So in that case, function A is the higher order function. We are using this again day in, day out in many of these array methods. Like we have filter, map, all these array methods that we have, right? So those are actually the mini higher order functions example, the built-in higher order functions, right? And we can always write of our own as well.
And this is also a very common interview question is, hey, can you explain what a higher order function is, or what are some higher order functions in JavaScript? So yeah, I think that covered it very well. So kind of moving forward from the terminology there, I think a good place to start is, how does someone create a function in JavaScript? There are a few different ways that you can kind of do it. And asking this question, I do realize that over just audio only, this could be a little bit tricky to describe.
I was also thinking.
But maybe just like a high level overview. How does someone actually go about declaring a function in JavaScript? Or maybe even better, what is your kind of personally preferred way to declare a function? Because we have named functions and arrow functions, which I'm sure you'll get to in a second, but what's kind of your preferences alongside of different ways that you can do it?
Yeah, so as you said, like there is named function, means you have function keyword, give a name, then the parenthesis, and if there are parameters, you mention the parameters and then the function body. Pretty simple. There is another way that you can define function is like as an expression. Like what we mean by expression is like you use let or const, I'm keeping var away. So let or const, and then the variable name equals to a value. So you can also define function in that way, like, const do something equals to function definition. And then you have arrow function, another, probably the latest most way of function declaring. So before arrow function came in, I used to go with the expression way of defining function. That was my favorite. But since arrow function came in, it's like widely adopted. I mean, if I go for any library or framework also based on JavaScript, it's like all kind of arrow function because of a reason. So yeah, arrow function is my favorite, I would say.
Gotcha. And how do you feel about the argument that, and this isn't me making this argument, like I regularly use arrow functions and it's kind of my approach, but I have heard the argument posed that, arrow function should more so be like a last resort thing, and you should tend to use just function definitions that, you start with a keyword function, then the name of the function, and do that because of readability purposes. How do you kind of feel about that argument versus just using arrow functions that might be more kind of anonymous and maybe, if you don't know what you're looking at, maybe it's not as clear, but how do you kind of feel about that argument?
Okay, so argument is good, it's healthy, but what I feel is like now if I want to code faster and I want to write as less as possible. That's where I think arrow function becomes very handy for me. And once I start doing it few times, it becomes almost like a norm of writing those arrow functions. And if I am actually putting my linting and the practices for programming for the team in such a way that we will be using kind of arrow function most of the time, right? It becomes also like our norm. When you're doing code review, we expect to see arrow functions more, and that's the way we pick it up. So I don't think the readability is an issue as long as you are setting that as a standard. But if like it's somewhere where the standard is not set and people can choose anything, so code reviewers will be more complex in seeing different varieties of things, right? So I know my argument is towards using it than not using it.
And I would say that it is like the modern way of doing it in JavaScript. And I think that as long as you keep it consistent on your team on how you like define functions, then it really doesn't matter. As maybe if someone's kind of newer to arrow functions and they're kind of used to the older way, it might take them like a few days to kind of get used to it. But I think that after you have a few days with it, like you'll kind of be fine with it. And, as long as you keep it consistent, then it's going to be pretty rare that you see an arrow function and you don't actually know that it's a function. So yeah, I think that's a very reasonable way to approach it. And kind of with arrow functions, are there any like functional differences between those and regular kind of named functions? I know there is like some handling differences of like the this keyword and some stuff that's a little bit more complex, but is there any kind of differences there that you kind of see with arrow functions compared to more just like function definitions and using the function keyword?
Yeah, so apart from the syntaxes, I think this keyword concept between a named function or a kind of general function and the arrow function is definitely different, because arrow function doesn't have the basic thing that we need to understand, that arrow function doesn't have its own execution context. It's always depends on in outer functions execution context, right? And that is where I think it differs most of the cases, right? So in regular function, there are varieties of way you can handle this, right? If you just write a function definition that this refers to the global object. If your function is a method, which just means inside an object, this refers to the enclosing object. If you use new keyword, this is to the instances that you are creating, right? If you're using call or bind, this refers to the first argument that you're passing to the call and bind. So there are multiple ways that what this refers to. This doesn't refer to one thing. But for arrow function, I think it is much simpler. This always refers to the outer thing. So if you have a callback function, which is an arrow function inside another function, outer function, this will refer to the outer function. If your arrow function is in the global scope, there is no this for this one, right? This will be undefined, because if you're trying to kind of get this. So this is one of the very basic difference. There are other differences out there, like for example, there is an argument object, right? A very special object like this, argument is also provided by JavaScript. The normal function has an argument. One is like very implicit. It's an array-like object. So whatever the argument value you are passing while invoking the function, in the function definition, you can actually read that as an argument, as an array-like object. But in case of arrow function, there is no such things. Like there is no such arguments object. If you want to like really play with argument, you have to use the spread operator to spread the arguments. New is another one. Like in general, the functions has two properties. One is they are callable, they are constructible. So it means that you can call the functions and you can construct object with the new keyword. But in arrow function is only callable. There is no constructible. You cannot use the new keyword. So there are varieties of such things that one need to keep in mind. I mean, JavaScript is such a language, is like once you know some of this internal, you wouldn't be blaming it much. But if you don't know internals, you will be abusing JavaScript a lot. So that's my learning over last many years.
Yeah, you put that very concisely, and like that's a tricky kind of area. And even for me, I work mostly in React, so I don't deal with like classes and this keyword a whole bunch. So like that can be kind of a tricky area for not working with it regularly. But like you said, there are some kind of weird parts of JavaScript. I don't know if there's a better way to put that, but if you understand some of what's going on there, it makes a lot more sense once you kind of understand what's kind of going on a little bit under the hood. So I think you did a great job with that. And I think that is also a very common interview question, to where someone will ask like, what's the difference between an arrow function and just like a regular function definition and stuff. And I think you did a great job there. So kind of moving forward, one terminology that you kind of used there was execution context. And that kind of relates to a question that I'm planning to ask you, kind of surrounding function scope and what that is. So could you maybe cover what an execution context is, and then from there we can kind of move into scope?
Yeah, so I'll just try to keep it simple, because this is again another topic without screen sharing and coding is a little difficult to. So before we move to scope, I think one thing to clarify is like in JavaScript, you can have nested functions. I think everything starts from there so that we all understand scope. So it means that there is outer function, inside that you can be an inner you can have an inner function, right? And there is a philosophy like if you have an inner function, from outside, you cannot access things which are inside the inner function. Rule number one, from your inner function, you can access everything which is in its outer function scope. So I think these two rules, as long as people understand, they understand everything about scope and closure. Okay. So these are the two very basic rules. So it means that whatever I am saying, like, I can access everything that is enclosed within my function body because it is enclosed. Plus, I have a reference to the scope which is just outside of me. It means my outside function. So it means that where and all my variables can live and exist and be in my own visibility as a function. That's defined my scope. To be keep it very blunt over there. So my visibility for the variable is like whatever is defined inside me, and the variables that is defined just where I am placed, my outside scope, right? But from the outside, that is really not true. from outside, it is always like upwards. I cannot really access things, which is so. This is what is defined basically the scope of the thing, and that's what also define the execution context. For my function to execute. Again, the jargon and the terminology is way bigger than the actual thing which is underlying. When I say execution context, it's like some hammer somebody is putting on it. It's really nothing but like what is in, when you define a function, what's in your control, basically where exactly your function is getting executed, and basically the surrounding scope that you're defining along with the function. It is really not more than that, right? And so these terminologies and these concepts we need to understand more with the code. So maybe the course that if people are saying it, they can actually go to the course and
definitely go check out the course that you created. I believe it is on your YouTube channel, correct?
Yeah, it's on my YouTube channel, and also published it on Free Code Camp YouTube channel. So both the places it's available.
Perfect. And your YouTube channel, is it TapasScript?
The name is TapasScript, but the handle is @Tapas. Yeah. So
gotcha.
Anything we can search. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll have it linked in the show notes and everything, so people can go find that. So yeah, I totally agree with your point there on that. In JavaScript, a lot of like terminology is just kind of jargon that makes things sound way more complex than they are, like execution context, higher order functions, callbacks, like all this stuff that if someone is new to programming, they probably have no idea what these terms are, and it sounds like really complex, but once you kind of look at it in the code and stuff, it's not as complex as I think it can sound when they just hear the terms there. So.
Yes, there are very basic rules that I was telling about the scope, right? You really don't have to, memorize a lot of this concept unless you're really going for an interview. You don't have to really memorize some of these sentences and words for you to like debug and figure out like why certain things are working or certain things are misbehaving. If you're in the raw JavaScript, not in TypeScript, these rules and regulations are something that to keep in mind. I think rest of the things will be second.
Yep, absolutely. And one kind of final thing regarding scope is one way that I've always thought about it is like a scope chain, in which you can always climb up the scope chain. So you can look into outer scopes, but you can't climb down the scope chain into inner scope. So that's another kind of way that just kind of made sense to me when I was first learning it. So with that, one last thing to cover here on functions before we get to the career advice is a terminology that people really struggle with, and I struggled with this a lot when I was starting out, and you mentioned it there when discussing scope, is closure. So what is closure in JavaScript?
Yeah, so this is another thing I think over the years, people have struggled with closure. How I see closure is like, again, you have to start from the fact that JavaScript can have nested function. So the inner function usually is your closure. Now what it closes, the name closure, it closes values, right? So what it means, again, it's a bit tricky without showing code, but I'll try to explain. Like you have an outer function, just imagine with me, you have an outer function and you have an inner function. Now you are passing an argument to the outer function, right? Now just now we told that inner function has an access to the outer scope. So that means that outer function, the value you are passing, your inner function has an access and will be able to use. So inner function will take that particular value and do any computation with that value. It can be done, right? And then you return the inner function from, inside the outer function. Now, when you call the outer function, your function execution is done, right? Outer function execution is done. But the best point here is that your outer function is actually returning the inner function, which is closing the value that you had passed to the outer function some time back, because your inner function is already accessing the value, right? So as you're closing the value, even after the lifespan of your outer function, this is giving you a very powerful handle that you can do the further computations with that value, without whatever the desired things you want to do. So that value that you are actually closing inside the inner function is closure. Actually, it's nothing more than that. It's very simple for people to understand. Closure is pretty simple. Just start with nested function. Try to understand the scope rules. Just now Ryan was also explaining up the scope, not down. And then what you do with the value that you pass through the outer function to the inner function, after outer functions execution done also, the value still leaves that you can actually utilize because outer function is returning the inner function along with that closed value. That's what is closure. That's what I understand. Without showing code, that's maximum I can explain.
Yeah. No, I think you did a great job. And I think that I think one area where people run into issues with closure is they don't fully understand scope before they get to closure, in which once you understand scope and you understand the idea of if you have an inner function within an outer function, that inner function can access all like the variables and context of the outer function. And if you return that inner function from the outer function and you want to go use that inner function elsewhere in your program, it's still going to maintain access to the context of that outer function, even once that outer function has technically like finished its execution context and that inner function has kind of enclosed all those variables and that context so where it can kind of continue to use it. And like you said, audio only makes it very difficult to kind of explain that. But I think, hopefully that made some sense to those listening. But before we end here, maybe let's just finish on, you had a video on kind of career advice. So for someone kind of newer on in their career, even myself, I'm about 4 or 5 years into like professionally working in this field. I would still consider myself newer on in my career here. So what would you kind of recommend to someone kind of someone just starting out, and then also maybe someone that's, 4, 5, 6 years in, looking to kind of, take things to the next level and maybe go into, whether it's an engineering manager or kind of a more senior engineering role, what would you kind of recommend for these individuals?
Yeah, so a few things that I can actually call out for folks who are just starting out. My advice to them would be is like, don't skip the fundamentals, for God's sake. Because you're just starting out and no rush, basically. I know, in offices or wherever, like you're working, you have to complete that job, you have to build that component, you have to do that routing and all this thing. That's fine, perfect. But spend some time understanding like what is going on under the hood, why certain things are happening certain way. Because when you empower yourself with that knowledge, you really make yourself apart from many other folks who are not doing it. And that's your added advantage. So one fine day when you're going for your career upgrade or you're going for an interview, you won't be in that mugging mode. You will be like, you have that wisdom already with you. It's just about recollecting that and getting ready, right? So that's a big difference, right? You can do a lot of other things than getting busy for a lot of preparation. So this is one advice for people like who are just starting. And in general, for any developer, this is what I learned a bit late in my life is like the power of networking, socializing with people, learning from the experience of others has immense value, right? I started it mostly from the COVID time, I would say. Before that, I was like in a shell, like working in an enterprise, just that's my life. So once I realized like how much important it is and rightfully doing it, right? It is not like you go try to network with somebody with an intention of you're comparing yourself with that person and then gets demotivated and come out. It's not like that. You get something from that person, put yourself into and get the best out of it. That's what, the mindset that if you can keep, that will be really amazing thing to do. And the last thing is about the side hustles. I'm sure, Ryan, podcast is your, greatest side hustle and that's your hobby and you like it. Yeah. Similarly, I started blogging as a hobby side hustle and that my mainstream job now, content creation, right? I left my professional career in an enterprise and just doing content creation right now, right? So you don't know like where your side hustles and hobby takes you in your career. So definitely find something apart from what you're doing in your regular life that's going to pay you off. Yeah. So these are the things that I would like to kind of call out.
Yeah, I think that's great. Learn the fundamentals. I think that's like for me when I was just starting out, I wanted to jump like straight to React and straight to the frameworks and stuff like that. But like that will burn you if you don't understand like the basics of web development of JavaScript, CSS, HTML, what everything else is kind of built on. So I think that's really good. Then also networking. And for networking, do you recommend like going to like different events, or how would you maybe recommend practically networking, or how have you kind of done it?
Good questions. As things are kind of opened up and people are really meeting in person, I think if you have an option to go for an event, just don't go for the swags, for example. Go to meet people, really make some connections, right? And talk to them, tell about you and like what you like to do, what you do. And then if you know them already, try to appreciate their work, make that connection so that you build that connection over there. And that has to be long lasting even after the event. Apart from that, finding some good connections, online is a bit tricky. You know that, like, finding some good connections on Twitter or any other place is a bit tricky. You don't know, like, what the person and all those things. But if you can figure out really good connection on Twitter and LinkedIn, that also is really awesome. So I would suggest in person is the best thing, and then leverage the online presence as well.
I 100% agree. That's great. And then I also agree on like your third point there of it can be really helpful to like kind of have like something on the side that you're doing as well. And I particularly like doing something related to like creating content, because normally it involves like teaching a certain area or subject, which for me, creating a course on Next.js or React or JavaScript really exposes areas that I don't know as well as I think I know. Like if I try to explain something that I really kind of am fuzzy on, it just doesn't come across very well. So I definitely need to really understand that before I can go teach it, which I think teaching things and creating content can really help your understanding and improve your skills as a developer. So with that, Tapas, I really enjoyed this podcast. I was kind of, grilling you on a bunch of different JavaScript function stuff that you might get in an interview, but I think you did an awesome job. So kind of with that, maybe one more time, where can people kind of find you and find your content and anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm usually there on Twitter and LinkedIn. The handle is at Tapas Adhikari. Same thing with YouTube. And that's where I teach people. I teach a lot of stuff on JavaScript, React, Next.js, and all this kind of stuff. I'm also working on a masterclass on JavaScript. Like that might come somewhat end of October. It will be live teaching. It's not like recorded video. It's like live teaching. And that's something I want to try out and see like how exhausted I will be. So
yeah,
let's see how it goes. So you can find me all those places. Please connect. I would love to connect to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed it.
Same here. Thanks, Ryan.